are here with Professor Wolfgang Merkel. He's professor for political sciences and social sciences at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And he's also director of the research unit Democracy and Democratization at the Berlin Social Science Center. Professor Merkel, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much for coming here to Quito to talk about participative democracy. Please, to begin with, would you tell us a little bit more about your work and your areas of investigation?
At the moment, I hope I don't lose my voice. At the moment, I'm working with my research group in Berlin on themes like, is there a crisis of democracy or is it an invention by democratic theorists? But we are also working on dictatorships, under which conditions do they fall, under which conditions do they survive. So it is the whole range of political regimes we do our work in present.
Professor Merkel also recently published a study on direct democracy, which you can find the link below. Professor Merkel, you state in your paper that key institutions like elections, like parliaments, they have lost power of integration and persuasion. You even talk about a ghost of the democratic crisis haunting us. Why do you think is the case?
Normally I'm a bit cautious in using the term crisis, because even if we use it for centuries, I would argue, we have not defined it yet very precisely what a crisis of democracy means. But what we see during the last decades, there's at least one ghost haunting democracy, and this is the ghost of inequality. We have seen increasing socio-inequality and socio-economic inequality throughout the last 3 decades, and there is no stop of this increase. The famous book of Thomas Piketty has this underlined as well. And what is problematic for democracy is that socio-economic inequality translates quite directly in political inequality. And one of the core principles next to liberty and control is equality. And if democracy uses this principle of equality, if more and more people dropping out of political participation because they feel not prepared for it, they don't have the cognitive resources, then democracy has a problem. I would say we also have to be somehow cautious using the singular, because there are differences between democracies. There's certainly a difference between Denmark, Sweden on the one side and Greece on the other side, only to name the European democracy. And again, if we go in other regions of the world, the differences increase. However, there is a problem. The one problem is inequality, and the other problem is supranationalization, what we used to call globalization of politics and policies.
Dr. Merkel, in your paper, your recent paper about democracy, direct democracy, you mentioned that these deficits and crises have repercussions on 3 aspects: participation, representation, and government. Among others, you discuss the low voter participation, the loss of confidence in key institutions. You also state that there is not quite clear who is governing in the 21st century.
Political and social scientists are also cautious in predicting what will happen in the future. But one thing seems to me clear: the dominant role political parties have played during the 20th century will not be any longer the same during the 21st century. And the problem democracy is, as that it has not invented other organizations and institutions which can take the place on of political parties. So democracy is in a kind of transitional phase. Political parties are losing acceptance within the society, and so they became more and more organizations of the state. And this is one problem. And the other problem I have already mentioned, it's not exactly clear who governs if it comes to the relation between the state and markets. Since the late 1970s, when Margaret Thatcher came along and Ronald Reagan implemented their neoliberal policies, they started to deregulate markets, and this turned out to be especially problematic for the financial markets. They are so powerful that states cannot control it anymore. And this is something against the spirit of democracy, that the citizens should have a say what is happening to their life, their economic welfare and social welfare. So it is not clear whether the markets or the governments really govern us during the next decades. And it's also not clear who can compensate for the loss of acceptance political parties are facing.
Okay, another question regarding your studies on how referendums receive little attention by citizens, implying a narrow democratic legitimization. How would you read the dynamics of referendums in Latin America, for example, in countries like Ecuador, where voting is mandatory?
First, I'm not a specialist on Ecuador, and here I am very modest in my comments. We always thought direct democracy, meaning especially referenda, could be a cure for the loss of acceptance of the representative institutions. But if we look more closely from an empirical point of view to referenda, we have to say most of the people do not vote. They do not go to the referenda, even much less than they go to general elections. This is at least the case for Europe. In Latin America, it seems to me there is a different trend. There are now innovations on participation. There is a higher turnout in referenda to some extent, and the lower classes seems to me better integrated at least into this political participation. If it comes to mandatory voting, I'm very much in favor of it. I'm very much in favor of it. It is not very popular in my country, in Germany. They would criticize it as something against personal freedom. But my proposal would be, if there is a mandatory voting, there should be one classification which says clearly, none of these parties. I do not vote for any of these parties. And this could send a signal to those who govern that the citizens are not so satisfied with the way they are governed. So it could also help to stop the dropping out of the lower classes from voting. If there is mandatory voting, then they have to go, and therefore I'm very much in favor of it.
So one striking finding of your study was the fact that direct democracy mechanism reach only a very modest segment of the population, namely well-educated people and wealthy people. What is even more depressing is the finding that men are considerable more represented than women. In your opinion, how do you think we can change this?
Let's first begin with the representation of women. No doubt women are not as good represented as men. And if you look to the Scandinavian states, for example, these are certainly the best democracies we have on the globe. You have more or less the same representation quota of men and women. If it comes to participation, they even go more to elections during the last time than men do. So there is progress. This is certainly not enough. But I don't see the same progress if it comes to the lower classes. This is much more the problem. We are losing the lower third of the society. They don't play any role anymore. They may be pacified by social policies, but they don't actively integrate themselves anymore into politics and policies. So what we see is a class-oriented oligarchization. And here I have to criticize parties, groups, and myself that we disregarded this class and inequality problem for many years. And there was a kind of cultural turn. We were used to look to minorities, to a better representation of homosexuals, of ethnic, religious minorities. And here democracies have been quite successful. But the left, or the moderate leftist and center parties forgot this class question. And so there is a turn necessary back to this problem of socioeconomic inequality.
Finally, your paper deals with the current debate in Germany to implement direct democracy mechanisms, such as referendums at the national level, where, if I understood correctly, there are no referendums. How do you see the perspectives for these mechanisms, and from both an European and German point of view?
I would say it does not matter that much. If Germany would implement referenda also on the national level, then how many would we have in a year? Probably one or two. And one or two decisions on the national level will be only a minor part of the whole policy production of laws coming out of the parliament. So sometimes we are overestimating the effects. But there are certain questions which one could ask the people. One has to be very sensitive which topics should be allowed to be voted on in referenda. I'm completely against questions which touch the right of minorities. I'm also against questions which touch taxes and public expenditures. But why not to talk about environmental issues? Why not put them on referenda? Topics of climate change and these topics. However, I would say this would be something which is not so relevant for the living conditions of the people. We would normalize Germany again because this is to some extent a legacy of the past, that we don't have this referenda on the national level, so we would be like France and other countries. However, I would not expect any big differences in the quality of democracy.
Well, Professor Merkel, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much.